Hi, everyone. I want to focus on the Janissaries today. If you know anything about Ottoman history, you may have heard about the Janissaries. Who are the Janissaries? We'll see. It means new army. And they were basically the crack special forces of the Ottoman army, special unit or section of the army created by the new Ottoman Empire to handle certain types of warfare. Um, and they have a specific origin story. Now we're going to talk about who the Janissaries were and specifically how they were part of the new centralizing power of the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th century. Now here are some examples on the left of depictions of the Janissaries. On the left, there is a European depiction. Please note the characteristic white headdress of the Janissaries here, where you have a sort of large white fabric thrown over back over the head and draping down. There's other accoutrements that sort of marking as a Janissaries, such as this little axe, etc. And we can see the same headdress here. Again, there's a band and then a mount of fabric that's then thrown backwards. Here, the Janissaries are each holding a type of weapon, usually obviously a sword, around their waist. And in this case, they're bringing back captives captured during military campaigns. As we said, we're basically in this period here around 1350 when the Janissaries were created. This is the period when the Ottomans are quickly expanding from a small principality around 1300, 1310 on the edge of the Byzantine Empire into quickly taking over large portions of northwestern Anatolia and even parts of what's essentially still part of Turkey today, but the Balkans. And then quickly under Murad I, expanding and taking over large portions of the Balkans. Now, to understand the role of the Janissaries, we have to understand the structure of the Ottoman army and specifically how it was comprised of during the reign of Murad, who was particularly responsible for creating the Janissaries. So the Ottoman army had three parts: akinjis, which are nomadic raiders on horseback. This formed the mass of the army in the initial period. These are drawn from the Turkish nomadic population. They come in quick, they raid, and then they take whatever they can, and then they leave before more formal troops can arrive. Akinjis were a menace, especially to people in villages on the frontier. And if we look at recollections of people even going as far as Veneto in what's today Italy, Akinji raids on these areas were vicious, quick, and often created a great deal of fear because these raiders would come in on horseback, going as fast as possible, creating rumors, trying to stir up fear, and then arrive, attack places, steal again animals, people, any valuables. People would be sold as slaves. And then they had the option, of course, of selling them to slave traders who would follow the Kinjis, or they would bring them back to cities themselves and sell them at a higher price. The problem, of course, is that if you bring back a slave to a city, you had to take care of that slave until you brought him back to a place where you could sell him or her. Now, Akinjis were initially the major component of the army, but there was another component, the Sipahis. And this is, again, part of the centralizing reforms that the Ottomans brought in. They create a sort of cavalry unit, which is rewarded by land grants. So they give people who distinguish themselves in battle and are good commanders grants to collect the taxes off a specific part of land. In exchange, these Sipahis, which just means cavalry in Persian, or were expected to bring a retinue of warriors every campaign season. The campaign season essentially went from late spring to early autumn. This is when people would go out to war and try to expand territory, because afterwards things get muddy or snowy and it gets impossible to move around. And at the same time, you have to go back home, administer territories, move animals around, etc. So the Sipahis were allowed to control an area that they also administered and collect the taxes of, that would be reassigned every few years after successful conquests. The better of a warrior you were and the better of a commander you were, the more you would be rewarded. So it was a sort of motivational system to raise armies. The bigger the land grant that you had, the more you were expected to bring. At the same time, again, it was a non-permanent system. People were not expected to hold on to the same TMARs or land grants for very long. In the third group, and this is the group we're going to talk about today, were the Janissaries, or what was called the Yeniçeri in Turkish. Yeni means new in Turkish. Çeri is an old word for army. And these were basically a sort of super elite slave troop and administrators under the direct command of the Sultan. So whereas the other groups were essentially semi-independent and not fully controlled, the Janissaries just served the Sultan. They were sort of a private army of his. And the interesting thing here is that they were recruited from a unique pool of people, and that is the Christian subjects in the Ottoman territory, specifically in the Balkans. What that meant is that they would, as we'll see, take a levy of children from certain towns and basically send them back for training, and then they would be turned into either soldiers or administrators, as we'll see in a second. Now, this is all part of the techniques of centralization in the 15th century. All of this are some of the innovations that the Ottomans brought in, innovations that frontier warriors often complained about as creating a sense of distinction between different warriors and different people in the empire, of reducing the freedom and amount of money that they had. And this is because they're ultimately, to some degree, successful in creating a more centralized state. And this is some degree very basic things, but they created new tax regimes. They created two classes of people, the so-called askari, the military class, and the ra'aya, which means flock, which were the tax-paying class. Most people were taxpayers, and askari were exempt from taxes, and so they collected the taxes and used them. But all of this was part of creating kind of new hierarchies in the empire. And similarly, they created a new form of army. One we just talked about, the Sipahis, the sort of feudal cavalry. The second part, though, was the Janissaries, which were a more centralized army of infantry. They were paid a wage. So the Sipahis were paid given a piece of land and told to collect the taxes from it. Why is that? Because ultimately it was more convenient to do that than try to collect taxes, send it back to Istanbul, and then redistribute the money. The Sipahis just receive the money in situ. And at the same time, as they're integrating more with the Byzantines and helping them out, they're also bringing in more and more Byzantine elites into the fold at that time. Now, how did the Janissaries become, how were they recruited? This recruitment process is called the devshirme. Devshirme means selection in Turkish. And they wanted basically the best possible people because they're creating a sort of elite set of army units. Now, the interesting thing again here is that they're taken from slaves from Christian communities in the Balkans to Lesser Anatolia. So these were Ottoman territories, and that makes it highly unusual because technically under Islamic law and most Islamic polities, they don't take people from within the territory of the empire, partially because they don't want locals, they don't want people with local connections. And even then, Christians and non-Muslims are given protection from being enslaved by the authorities in general in Islamic law. And therefore, most slaves, whether the elite military kind or normal, came from the edges of the Islamic world, places like the Caucasus or Ethiopia, places that did not have substantial Muslim populations, and that could be raided for slaves. In this case, the Ottomans, for reasons that are still not clear, decided to take their own Christian subjects, even though it was clearly against, let's say, Islamic law. We're not talking about a lot of people here. People, they would come to villages. They would have collect a small number of boys from that village. If a family had already given up a boy, they would not be taken. If there was only one male son, or if he was the breadwinner, that boy would not be taken. They usually would be taken pre-adolescence, early adolescence, etc. Between kind of, let's say, 10 to 15 years of old. They would be put in these red costumes. So if they ran away, they would be easily found. Their descriptions would be registered in a journal, in a notebook. And then when they reached Istanbul, they would then their description would be compared to make sure that everyone was there. And what we can see here is the one and only visual depiction of this process that we have. We have a janissary and sort of qadi or some sort of magistrate being able to write in registries. And then we have janissaries kind of controlling the crowd. We have a mother, it's obviously very frustrated with giving up her child. We have some priests in the background here. And then here we have the children that are being taken. In total, we're not talking about a large number of people. Probably only a few hundred a year, if that. Even then, over the course of this entire process, it's probably 20 to 30,000, 50,000 people, if that. It's a very small and elite group of slaves who will ultimately end up being the rulers and administrators and elite army officials of the empire. So this is very different from the example of, Atlantic slavery, in which there were millions and millions of Africans taken from West Africa and parts of East Africa over to the Americas. We're really talking about a small group of people. Now, once they were taken, they were sent to Istanbul. They were brought to the palace, where they were again compared to the description that they have. A sort of acculturation segment followed, in which they sent them to live in Turkish farms with Turkish peasants, so that way they learned Turkish. After a year or two, having learned Turkish and worked on these farms, they were then assessed. The best people, the ones that were smartest, were actually kept and trained as administrators, and they were sent into the palace that was built after the Ottomans conquered Istanbul, and literally trained in the same courtyard and same world as the future princes, honoring princes. So they would all become part of a very clear cohort of future rulers. And these are the people that end up becoming grand viziers, heads of the army, heads of different important pieces of the empire itself. Those that were less gifted were sent off and trained as soldiers. And even then, they were formed an elite unit of soldiers. Again, paid in a stipend and given all sorts of other privileges. Now, the Janissaries were organized into regiments. Those regiments were organized by, for some reason, according to soup or kitchen vocabulary. So they were called ojaks. the regiments. An ojak is a hearth, a place where you keep a big fire where you would cook. Um, Now, each of those regiments had a head to them. It was called the chorbajil, or the soup maker, and all the ranks within the Janissaries themselves were kitchen related. Now, when they would rebel, and eventually they would rebel, or they wanted to show that they reject the authority of the sultan, they would do is they had these big soup pots they cooked all their food on. They would turn them over and spill out the foods, and they rejected basically the sultan's food, and therefore they would reject their his munificence, and therefore start a rebellion. But that's neither here or there at this point. At this point, they're basically the elite of the empire. And this is, as we'll see, an interesting development. By the way, there's some Sufi orders that became associated with the Janissaries, in particular the world of Haji Bektash. We talked about before. He was a frontier warrior who started this lodge in the middle of Anatolian steppe. But for reasons that I won't get into, he became affiliated with the Janissaries as their sort of patron saint. Now, you might ask, well, how did these people not run away or maintain connections to their communities? And many of them did. Many didn't. Of course, many just remained, were manumitted, that was released from slavery, and then went on to become elite soldiers or elite administrators, and perhaps never looked back or attempted to contact their family. Perhaps they didn't know how to speak the language or didn't know where they came from anymore. But many of them actually did continue to keep some sort of connection. The most famous example is this man. His name is Sokulu Mehmed Pasha. This case depicted in two European depictions, which you can see are based off of each other. Sokulu Mehmed Pasha came from a place called Sokol, which is a village, I think, in Bosnia. And he ended up becoming one of the most powerful grand viziers in the 16th century. You can see he ruled during some of the period that was kind of the high point of the empire. Now, it turns out that he was taken as part of the Devshirme, and ultimately trained and then rose to the ranks to become the Grand Vizier. His brother, however, stayed at home in the village, but he also had a great career. He ended up being trained in Greek, becoming a priest, and rising through the ranks until he himself actually became the head of the Christian, the Christian Orthodox Church, and became the patriarch. Now, later in life, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha built a mosque for himself with all of his wealth. And then he also commissioned a church to be built for his brother in their hometown. Now, that church doesn't stand anymore, but apparently in its, in its mosaic or illustrations showing the founders of the church and the patriarch, etc., apparently they have the two of them depicted together. So, given the fact that Janissaries reached such incredible heights, became the Grand Vizier, they became the chief of the army, were the most powerful soldiers, were paid well, etc. Were they slaves? Well, in the long short, yes, they were inserted into the society as slaves. Ultimately, they were manumitted. Around the age of 20, after their training, they were released. They converted to Islam, and then they were just left to be free. But most of them stayed in the system, partially because they were given a great deal of respect and power and money, but not all of them. But they had a great deal of loyalty to the dynasty. They were slaves, technically. They were what we call kul, so literally means slaves or servants. Often the term is used kapekul, so slaves of the port. The port is the name for the building where the government was. And technically everyone who worked for the government was a slave, especially at this point. In any case, they're part of the askari, or ruling class. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that these janissaries could not continue to pass on their special janissary status to their children. The only people recruited through the system were the ones recruited through the Devshirme. So the future administrators, future soldiers, at least in the 15th and 16th century, were ultimately recruited again through slavery until the late 16th century. On the left here, you have a very nice depiction by an Italian artist, Gentile Bellini, who was brought over to the Ottoman Empire to work as a painter. And he provides this very nice sketch of a Janissary sitting down. You can see both the quiver of arrows, the bow, the sword, and the traditional headdress here. Now, you might think, isn't it weird to have an elite army recruited through slavery? But in fact, it was very common. It was probably the most common way of creating an army in the Islamic world. Now, what the Ottomans did that was different is that they took their own Christian subjects and turned them into slaves, which was very unusual. But this was a common thing from the very beginning. Let me see if I have another slide now. From around 850 in the Abbasid Empire, they started recruiting Turks, nomadic Turks, through slavery, training them to be elite warriors, and then creating special armies. Now, the problem with that is that often, if you give those armies enough power and you isolate the ruler, the slave army will just become its own power, or manipulate the ruler and the succession of rulers. In certain cases, like in Cairo, so right to the south of where the Ottomans were, was an area called the Mamluk Empire. The Mamluks literally means slaves. They didn't call themselves Mamluks. They called themselves Circassians and Turkish Empire. But they ruled Cairo. They kicked out the Crusaders. They stopped the Mongols. They were a very powerful force. The interesting thing is that they were basically an elite slave army in which they just decided ultimately to take power from the sultans themselves and make themselves sultans. Rather than passing on power to their children, each generation basically, with a few exceptions, tended to be a new generation of slaves taken from the Caucasus. The same thing was happening in South Asia. And in fact, right at the same time as the Mamluks in the Delhi Sultanate, you have a similar situation in which the slave army simply take powers and make themselves sultans. In South India or South Central India in the Deccan, there's also other areas of slavery. So they're taking their slaves, not from the Caucasus, which is a bit far away, but from East Africa. And in this case, East African slaves would become major generals, etc., like this guy, Malik Ambar, who served the ruler of Ahmednagar and eventually became basically the ruler of it. So one thing to think about is, do you consider Janissaries slaves given their elite status? And ultimately, if you were a ruler, would you trust a slave to rule, to govern your empire, to be your elite guard? And this goes back to the idea of, like, what is it that makes slaves trustworthy, at least in the minds of the Ottoman elites? And I think this is a difficult thing for us to understand today, because when we think of slavery, we think of people being forced into something they don't want to do. And obviously, there is that aspect to it. But when I ask students, why do they think that the Ottomans, that the Janissaries were loyal, the answer always comes back to they're being brainwashed. And I don't think that's really it. The idea here is why is it that slaves are trustworthy is because they don't have local connections. What makes someone in the army not trustworthy is someone who's going to put their private interest before the interest of the sultan or the dynasty or the state. And slaves don't have that because they don't have connections to local society, ideally, right? They're not coming from a province, but they're coming from very far away, and they are being trained, and they're in a sense dependent on the sultan or whoever owns them for their wage, their prestige, and their place in society. And this makes them particularly trustworthy. And in fact, if you look at the Ottomans and their lowest period, when Tamerlane comes in and attacks them, everyone abandons them because they knew they were going to lose. All their frontier warriors, all the people, all their other allies abandoned them. The only people that stay with the Ottomans are their Janissaries. So in this case, the slave army is the most loyal and most capable army. So we'll leave it at that for now. I wish you Pleasant day.